Spent any measurable amount of time on Twitter recently or catching up with all your relatives over 40 on Facebook, you know that our country's political climate is a scary one. Vocal minorities dominate political discourse, and these screaming matches only serve to drive people further and further from the middle ground. This problem is called political polarization, and it's the reason why a distribution of our population's political ideologies has gone from looking like this in 1994 to this in 2017. These graphs are from research entitled Political Polarization in the American Public, conducted by the Department of Political Science at Stanford. If political polarization continues to develop, and we don't take the necessary steps to encourage compromise and thoughtful discussion, it could definitely be a contributing factor to the downfall of our country. As I've researched political polarization, I've uncovered some pretty alarming information about this growing divide. Today I'll be explaining why political polarization is a growing and dangerous issue, as well as the steps we can take to ensure that our nation is not torn apart by this ever-growing force. In today's age of technology, a huge amount of political conversation happens on social media. In their study entitled Exposure to Opposing Views on Social Media, researchers from the Department of Sociology at Duke gave people a financial incentive to follow a Twitter bot that pretty much spewed political ideas that conflicted with their own, something like 25 tweets a day. And what they found was that after 1 month, these participants had become even more set in their ways and more polarized than before. So while many may think that this newfound opportunity to engage in discourse with people from all around the world from various walks of life will contribute to more compromise, it's actually creating an environment in which political polarization can thrive and grow. An increasing number of Americans identify as independent, 42% compared to 29% Democrats and 27% Republicans, according to the 2017 survey conducted by Gallup, an American research company. While this may seem like a good sign, an increasing number of voters voting based on relevant issues instead of blind party allegiances, it's actually a major contributing factor in the divide between Democrats and Republicans. In 35 states, independents cannot vote in primary elections, and independent voter turnout and political involvement is statistically less than their partisan counterparts, which means that as this continues, more polarizing extremist candidates will continue to win these elections and find their way into office. Another huge contributor to political polarization is selective exposure. Selective exposure is defined as an individual's tendency to favor information which reinforces their pre-existing views while avoiding contradictory information. A study entitled Knowledge versus Beliefs by Youngwon Kim, a PhD at the University of Texas, found that people were far more likely to consume politically charged media that coincided with their own beliefs. This tendency did not have a drastic effect on these people's knowledge of the prevalent issues, but it did heavily affect their ideologies and beliefs associated with the candidates. For example, liberals who, in the study, who consumed heavily liberal news were far more likely in the 2008 election to believe that John McCain's age made him unfit for the presidency. This manipulation of people is 100% intentional and done equally by both political parties in order to mobilize their voter bases. But it completely works against cooperation as people create these virtual echo chambers in which they reinforce their own biases and become even more set in their ways. Motivated numeracy is one of the biggest obstacles we must overcome when trying to tackle political polarization. Our brain relies on two separate systems of cognition when drawing conclusions. The first system is an egocentric system in which we are trusting ourselves to be the experts. The system is a fast, automatic, subconscious system of thought. The second system is an alter-centric system in which we are trusting others over ourselves. This is very slow, deliberate, conscious thought, and it's more difficult to do. Numeracy is defined as the ability to understand numbers and draw the correct conclusions from data. The Berkeley Science Review's article, Motivated Numeracy, references a study done by Dan Kahan in which he found that people higher in numeracy were far more likely to fall victim to identity protective cognition. This means that When making conclusions, people are switching back and forth between these two systems in order to draw a conclusion that fits their own pre-existing biases. This is why people often scrutinize every little detail of a study that conflicts with their own ideals, while agreeing completely and blindly with those that coincide with them. So we've established that political polarization is a growing concern in our society. But what can we do about it? Well, first, we need to expand nonpartisan primary elections to all 50 states. Currently, only 15 states have open primaries in which everyone can vote no matter their party affiliation, according to openprimaries.org, which is an advocacy group on this topic. Which is, again, a huge problem because this will only lead to candidates and elected officials that are more polarizing and more extreme in their ideals. We also need to increase voter turnout rates drastically, particularly in midterm and local elections, because really Americans, no matter their party affiliation, a huge percent of us fall very close to the middle of the political spectrum. The minorities fall towards the outside. Yet, a lot of these people are the ones who are less politically motivated and active than their more extreme counterparts, which means that, again, we're ending up with a lot of voters that aren't voting. According to an article from Stanford News published just last week, about 50% of eligible voters did not participate in this last midterm election. So setting up an automatic registration system, providing incentives, or even making voting mandatory would ensure that the elected officials are far more representative of our country's largely moderate views on many of these issues. Finally, we need to encourage media outlets to facilitate thoughtful discourse, and we also really need to step up our fact-checking efforts. Now, granted, these media outlets are businesses, so assuming that is as impossible as it sounds, the least we can do is to at least get news from as many sources as possible and stay politically informed from as many viewpoints as you can on these issues. Despite its growing prevalence, political polarization is not a new thing in this country. Notable examples of political polarization in extreme cases is the Civil War of the 1860s and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. So we've seen this before, and we've seen how bad it can get. So what might our society look like if we take the necessary steps and return back to a world with thoughtful discourse? Well, we might have a general population that was actually able to engage in civil debate without relying on personal attacks, which is kind of a crazy thought. We could have a real progress made by Congress that spans presidencies instead of this 4 to 8 year cycle of doing and undoing. We could have politicians actually celebrated for making compromise instead of criticized by their constituents for being too weak or for giving in. So what can you do about it? Well, first and foremost, we all need to stay politically active and informed, which includes registering to vote and participating in all elections. But more than that, I'd like to issue you all a challenge. I challenge you to do your best to return civility to our political discussions. And instead of discussing politics with those like you, attempt the far more difficult task of trying to talk with those on the other side of issues and find common ground. By these means, and these means only, is how our generation can de-escalate political tensions in the United States and ensure that we stay strong and unified.